So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sheila McIlraith. I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, Canada's CFAR AI Chair at the Vector Institute, and an Associate Director and Research Lead here at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, SRI. I'm delighted to moderate today's SRI seminar featuring guest speaker Lucy Suchman. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the home to and traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While some of you are joining from different places today, we invite you to reflect on the history and the relation of the land that you are on. So a few logistics before we begin. This session is being recorded. Lucy will speak for about 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A. During the Q&A, we encourage you to engage by using the raise hand function in Zoom control, or to type questions into the chat, and someone will let you know when it's your turn to speak. If you feel comfortable doing so, it would be great if you turned on your camera so that we can see you when you ask your question. Now, it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce Lucy Suchman, who has done pioneering foundational work at the intersection of social science, computer science, and human-computer interaction, and who has been and continues to serve as an important voice for humanity. Lucy is a professor emeritus at Lancaster University in the UK and was previously a principal scientist at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC, where she spent 20 years as a researcher and where her work on corporate ethnography fundamentally changed how technology was designed. Her research works at the intersection of anthropology and the fields of feminist science and technology studies, focused on the socio-technical imaginaries, material practices, and politics of technology design. Lucy's current research extends her long-standing critical engagement with the field of artificial intelligence and human-computer interaction to the domain of contemporary militarism. Lucy has published 2 books, Plans and Situated Actions, and also Human-Machine Reconfigurations. Her work has led to numerous accolades, including the Benjamin Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Science, the ACM SIG Chi Lifetime Achievement Award, the Society for Social Studies of Science John Desmond Bernald Prize for distinguished contribution to the field, and also several honorary doctorates. Throughout her life, Lucy's been active in advocating for social responsibility and walking the walk, not just talking the talk, most recently serving as an expert panelist at the UN's Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons and as a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. We're honored to have Lucy with us today, and her talk is entitled Closed Worlds and the Constitutive Outsides of Artificial Intelligence. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Sheila and Daniel, for the invitation, and to everyone for being here. And I'm thinking that one of the benefits of this medium is that some of you can be enjoying your lunch while you listen. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. And hoping that you can see that first slide. Okay. So I'm going to start by acknowledging a small change, which you might have caught in the first word of my title from what was advertised, from closed to open worlds. And you'll see as we go that these are really 2 sides of the same coin, and that I'm going to be examining both. But I want to flag which of those sides is to me the most fundamental, because it's in open worlds that what I'm referring to as the constitutive outsides of AI are to be found. And I'm using the phrase constitutive outsides here in the sense developed by feminist theorist Judith Butler as all of that which makes something possible or articulable through its exclusion from the domain of what matters. And I hope what I mean by that with respect to AI will be clear or clearer by the end of this talk. And certainly that we can come back to this in the questions. The thoughts that I'm presenting today are intended as a contribution to what I see as a small but growing movement to resist the proposition that artificial intelligence is the driving technology of our age. This is an assertion that, whether it's offered as cause for celebration or for alarm, serves the interests of those who are invested in AI's expansion. The aim is to anchor debate about the efficacy of algorithmic technologies in their politics, raising a set of questions that are otherwise, I think, too absent from the discussion. So to start with some basics, who defines the problem to be addressed? And how is the range of possible solutions predetermined and circumscribed as a matter of technology, and more specifically, in this case, AI? Given the necessary reductions and inevitable erasures that are involved in datafication, which is the prerequisite for AI, what does it mean to engage responsibly in the development of algorithmic systems? And what would it mean to put AI in its place, where it would be considered as one useful but limited tool within a wider set of methods for the diagnosis of complex problems and collective work toward just resolutions? My own engagement with these questions has been focused on the domain of data-driven warfighting, which is where the expansion of algorithmic systems has its most immediately lethal effects. Data-driven warfighting and the martial epistemologies that sustain it, exemplified in this figure, which I'll come back to shortly, are based in the technopolitical imaginary named by historian of science Paul Edwards as the closed world. My argument in brief is that as a product of closed world imaginaries that have been materialized historically from the plantation to the factory floor to the battle space, the project of AI systematically denies the uncontainable openness of its worlds, including, in this case, the constitutive outsides of the machine that militarism imagines itself to be. To anticipate where I'm heading with some help from Canadian singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen in the lyrics to his song Anthem, there is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. While the apparatuses of militarism are pervasive, their closure is never complete. The question then is how the cracks in the military machine can be amplified as a contribution to wider collective efforts to interrupt the operations of militarism and to expand the space for new initiatives in negotiated internationalism. The closed world, as I mentioned, is historian of science Paul Edwards' name for the ideology that underwrote the Cold War arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century, which he describes brilliantly in his 1996 book of that title. So in my thinking, I set this against the this kind of imperial standoff against a decolonial imaginary named by anthropologists Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blaser in their 2018 book of that title as a world of many worlds. This follows calls for them by indigenous leaders, most famously the Zapatista in Chiapas, Mexico, for, in their words, quote, a world where many worlds fit. So I want to suggest that we can think of these as two aspirational approaches to global security. One based on containment through military domination, the other on negotiated coexistence across even possibly incommensurable difference. I start from the premise that technologies of datafication, particularly those currently promoted under the sign of AI, require closed worlds for their operation, and that understanding that requirement can help to clarify data's limits. Acknowledging the limits of datafication, in turn, opens our thinking to other modes of knowledge making that might configure our relations differently, both with each other and with the more than human world. We can begin to unpack the limits of data with the help of a forthcoming book titled Incomputable Earth. In her introduction to the collection, editor Antonia Majaka articulates the legacies and limits of computing as a technology of command and control. Antonia designates three dimensions to the limits of datafication. First, what she calls epistemological excess, or the knowledge or knowledges, to emphasize that there are multiple knowledge systems that exceed and escape algorithmic capture. Secondly, political remainders, that is, excluded knowledges and devalued forms of labor on which computational systems depend. And then finally, and crucially, what she calls generative potential, that is, those critical creative moments that prefigure alternative knowledge practices, oriented in the case of incomputable Earth toward ecological regeneration rather than continued extraction on a planetary scale. And so while these are articulated here in relation to the climate crisis, I suspect these dimensions will be recognizable to those of you engaged in critical data studies in other domains. They're identified by Antonia as elements of a profound critique, which is the larger project of this collection, of the concept of the Anthropocene, and more fundamentally, of the technopolitical imaginaries that position man, or the human with initial capitals, as Earth's planetary steersman or overseer. An essential element of the critique, as Antonia puts it, is to, quote, is to decapitalize the human, opening that figure to the multiple knowledges and practices that comprise human beings. The Earth, Antonia writes, is not a globe, nor a system, nor a spaceship hurtling through space, demanding steersmen who know how to navigate through the cosmic debris of their own making. When the vessel becomes planetary, the kybernetic art of navigation mutates into something far more troubling, a fantasy of total system control, where Earth itself becomes the ship, is living processes reduced to variables in a computational helm. The contemporary Kuberneticos stands at the helm of spaceship Earth with instruments capable of measuring everything, yet cannot see that the very act of steering perpetuates the shipwreck, end quote. I think this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. So I'll come back to the figure of the computational helm through the case of data-driven warfighting, as it perpetuates the shipwreck of planetary insecurity. A conjoining premise between command and control of the planet and of the battlefield is that to grasp the wholeness of something requires a position exterior to the thing to be comprehended. Now more than ever, the promise of that computational grasp rests on practices of algorithmic intensification, an alternative expansion of the acronym AI suggested to me by Andrew Clement. The techniques and technologies that travel under the sign of AI are currently dominated by so-called machine learning, and its elaboration is deep neural networks. Computational techniques that extract statistical correlations, which are then selectively designated by humans as legible patterns, extracts those from data sets based on the adjustment of relevant parameters according to either internally or externally generated feedback. These results are then used as the basis for automated prediction, recommendation, and decision systems, which in turn reinforce the classificatory schemas on which they are trained. Along with the translation of text into calculable tokens made famous by large language models, contemporary AI technologies operate over digitized images to generate so-called computer vision, the limits of which are unpacked nicely in this blog post from 2012, the year in which the computer vision problem was declared to be solved, you may recall, by the success of the convolutional neural network architecture named AlexNet. The post is by computer scientist Andrej Karpathy, who was then senior director of AI at Tesla. And this is also referenced by Melanie Mitchell in her wonderful book, Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans. So what would it take, Karpathy asks, for a computer to understand this image as you or I do? He challenges us to think explicitly of the culturally specific knowledge that informs our seeing and makes the image sensible to us. So here's an initial list. You recognize it as a photo of a group of people who are together in a place that looks like a locker room. And of course, we could go on in some detail about how we identify this as a locker room. You recognize Barack Obama from the profile of his head. It helps that he's in a suit and that he's surrounded by other people in suits. And this also suggests that they don't really belong in this place, but they're just visiting, though from the photo alone, it's hard to know why or where exactly. You recognize that there's a person standing on a scale, even though the scale is white and it blends in with its background. You've likely used the person's pose and knowledge of how people interact with objects to figure that out. You recognize that Obama has his foot positioned just slightly on top of the scale. You know enough of how the physical world works to assume that Obama's foot applies a force on the scale. Since the scale measures the force that it's applied to it, it will overrepresent the weight of the person standing on it. The person measuring his weight is likely not aware of Obama doing this. You derive this from his position, the fact that he can't see directly behind him, and that he's not very likely to sense that slight push of Obama's foot. You understand that people are self-conscious about their weight. You also understand that the weight shown will probably be higher than what the person expects. In other words, you think about implications of the events that are about to unfold seconds after this photo was taken and what the people in the photo might think and feel. You see that both Obama and the people watching appear to find the situation funny. Obama is joking around. And finally, the fact that the perpetrator here was at the time the US president makes this more amusing than it would be if we didn't know any of these people. And of course, others who look at it may know many more of them than I've identified. We understand what actions are more or less likely to be undertaken by different people based on their status and identity, and that this is a bit outside the norm. As Karpathy observes, we could go on indefinitely, but the point here is that you've read off a huge amount of information from the scene in the moments that you look at the picture and smile, as Karpathy says, the picture above is funny. In contrast to this narrative reading of the photo's lively subjects and activities and relationships, algorithmic operations require rendering worlds of interest into data through a process that necessarily, as we say, reduces the heterogeneity and contingency of the worlds that data claim to represent. The aggregated discreteness and the abstracted homogeneity of each datum is what makes data calculable. This becomes a problem, Lisa Gittleman and co-authors have argued, when data are naturalized by the erasure of the practices through which classification and enumeration gets done. As Jeffrey Bowker first articulated the problem, quote, raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea, end quote. Figured as already delineated into units of information, raw data suggests a form of naturally occurring resource awaiting extraction and refinement, an expression Paula Ricaurte observes of the coloniality of power. Data refinement includes the statistical transformation of traces of past events into predictions of probable futures. Even more than previous documentary media, data in the form of traces left by digitization beg enormous questions of translation and erasure. The operation of closure through datafication is part of what Orit Halpern characterizes in her book Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason since 1945, as an, quote, aspiration for the perfect and unadulterated transmission of information as control of the future within a self-referential and contained space, end quote. My aim in the remainder of this talk is to examine how the hegemony of computing relies upon it and is sustained by investments in closure as the enabling condition for datafication, and how datafication is a form of world-making made possible through zones of ignorance regarding that which is incomputable. I'll try to unpack that for you, drawing on my current work on the closed worlds of militarism and data-driven warfighting, exemplified by the United States, but most tragically operative in Israel's assault in Gaza. My focus on U.S. militarism reflects not only my position as a U.S. citizen, but also the extraordinary position of the U.S. as a militarist hegemon. One way of datafying that hegemony is to translate it into levels of spending. So here is a graph showing relative military spending in 2024, which makes clear that the United States is the overwhelmingly dominant military power. The US defense budget exceeds that of the 9 next most heavily armed countries in the world combined, including both China and Russia. At latest count, the US maintains 877 military bases around the world in 95 countries. And yet, in this context, we find the continuation of a discourse of US vulnerability, most recently framed as a new AI arms race between the US and China. Within this frame, the figure of AI becomes both a threat to security from them and a promise of security for us. And that's how the logic of arms races work, as each side increases investment in that which threatens both, a framing that obviously serves the interests of those who reap the resulting profits. Oh, sorry. And that brings us back to the figure in my opening slide, featured in a press conference in 2021, in which Charles Pope, then Secretary of the United States Air Force, announced the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2 initiative. Quote, as envisioned, he promises, JADC2 will allow U.S. forces from all services to sense, make sense, and act upon a vast array of data and information, fusing and analyzing the data with the help of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and providing warfighters with preferred options at speeds not seen before. Here's another rendering of JADC2. This is figure 1 from the U.S. Department of Defense's summary of the initiative released in March of 2022. The figure, which was titled in a kind of homely spirit, the JADC2 placemat, was characterized by analysts from the Hudson Institute, a conservative think tank, as, quote, a graphic that was confusing even by Defense Department standards, end quote. Confusing, perhaps, but also illuminating. So we can start at the center of the diagram, where you'll find the canonical decision cycle, operating as a cognitivist reduction of warring bodies to a black box taking input received through its sensors, processing that input, and producing output in the form of action. Each step in the cycle of decision is expanded into its associated components. Moving left to right, we start with what sources the input, and that's imagined as data streaming in from the world beyond the frame and before the operations begin, and channeled into a set of stacks, the general architecture of computing. In this case, the stacks correspond to the current sorting of domains of warfighting into territories. So we have air, land, sea, space, and cyber, which together comprise a set of interlocking and interoperable systems. These input sources are then funneled through the structuring filters of attributes, architectures, and interfaces to make the results of the sensing apparatus accessible to decision, or more accurately, to the further machinery designed to make sense of the input through the intersections of predictive analytics, machine learning, and the residually floating signifier, AI. The aim of all of this data processing is the generation of output to be implemented by people, processes, and authorities, enacting the JADC2 vision that joins together, as we're moving over to the right-hand side, the 11 combat commands to manage the state actors whose positioning as threats provides the justifying grounds for the program. And then floating somewhat ambiguously below and between all of this is the warfighting network, figured as a kind of cross between the iconic tank and the promissory cloud, all joined together by the dotted lines of electronic transmission. Finally, hovering along the bottom of the frame is the repository of doctrine, and at the top, the program's aim, that is, quote, the warfighting capability to sense, make sense, and act at all levels and phases of war across all domains and with partners to deliver information advantage at the speed of relevance, end quote. Cleanly bounded by its frame, the JADC2 placemat diagrams the dream of containment that characterizes modern martial epistemology. To dig into this more deeply, we can trace the diagram's center back to the marriage of martial epistemology with mid-20th century information processing psychology, which produced the dominant conceptualization of military cognition in the form of the decision cycle, a kind of lifeless diagram that is usefully translated to either persons or systems. This is the iconic observe, orient, decided, act, or OODA loop, first set out in the mid-1990s by U.S. Air Force Colonel John Boyd in a series of DoD briefing papers. Most relevant for my analysis is not so much the figure as the white space in which it appears. The ground that I'm suggesting is the information processing machine's constitutive outsides. The model is elaborated in a recent rereading of Boyd by his associate Chet Richards. Richards emphasizes that despite the common depiction, Boyd never actually figured his conception of the loop as a simple circular course of action. In a much more cybernetic model, Boyd rediagrams the OODA loop as shown here and offers this reading focused on the critical phases of observation and orientation. He writes, "The entire orientation bubble, including the blocks and all the interactions between them, represents our mental models of reality that are making predictions about the effects of our actions. The observation bubble includes all the ways we bring information from the external world, as well as about our own bodies and minds." And when I read these diagrams, I'm always most interested in the observation bubble, the input end. Datafication on this model will require the translation of those arrowed objects labeled unfolding circumstances, outside information, and unfolding interaction with environment into computationally legible signals that will control the conduct of war. Again, the bounded units of the diagram's bubbles and the white spaces in which it floats at once presume and artfully avoid the question of relations between inside and outside, or the figure and its ground. Since the 1990s, the OODA sequence has continued to serve as a normative model of what in common military parlance is called situational awareness, promoted most industriously by Mika Ensley, former chief scientist of the United States Air Force. Situational awareness is defined by Ensley as, quote, "the perception of environmental elements and events with respect to time or space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their future states," end quote. Figured as a self-referential cybernetic loop, this technopolitical imaginary enacts a world in which that which escapes datafication no longer counts. The problems that arise are framed in terms of insufficiencies in the number of signals and the amount of data available, along with the speed of its transmission and processing, rather than anything more fundamental about how military knowledge systems make their worlds. With my colleague Erich Reichborn-Kienerud, whose book The World According to Military Targeting is just out from MIT Press, I'm tracing the martial epistemologies that sustain militarism as the predominant approach to global security. Conceptualized as responsive to input from a world positioned outside the military machine, populated with threats, martial epistemology mobilizes socio-technical practices of gaming and simulation to produce output in the form of targets and prescriptions for action. This is an apparatus designed to fix the unruly enemy and bring order and predictability to the problem of war's irremediable chaos. And increasingly, this has meant turning the problem of knowing war into a question of data and data processing. While the focus of military doctrine is on the processing of data in the service of command and control, we're interested in the relations through which the raw data that comprise the input to the military machine, which are naturalized through terms like data collection or capture, how they are cooked into features taken as relevant to military planning. Put another way, we want to highlight how the battle space is figured through an objectivist onto epistemology that treats threats identified through data profiles as independent of and prior to military operations, rather than seeing how both martial epistemologies and military action are implicated in the generation of architectures of enmity. As Eric observes, the apparatus of military targeting renders worlds designed for war, in which the only rational and logical way of thinking about security is through military supremacy. In this world, war becomes the definition of normality and the condition of possibility for the future. At the same time, the conditions and means of knowledge production themselves are messy and chaotic, far from the neat story of military intelligence discovering and compiling information about the world out there. For the U.S. military, this partial epistemology can be traced back at least to U.S. operations in Southeast Asia, articulated in 1969 by General William Westmoreland, then Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, who offered these thoughts to colleagues over lunch, quote, "On the battlefield of the future, enemy forces will be located, tracked, and targeted almost instantaneously through the use of data links, computer-assisted intelligence evaluation, and automated fire control. I see battlefields on which we can destroy anything we locate through instant communications and the almost instantaneous application of highly lethal firepower. With cooperative effort, no more than 10 years should separate us from the automated battlefield." While the U.S. effort to implement Westmoreland's fantasy in Vietnam was an infamous failure, this year actually marks the 50th anniversary of the United States military defeat in Southeast Asia. The project of data-driven omniscience and weapon systems automation lives on. Some 50 years later, the U.S. Department of Defense still presents this vision as an imminent reality. What has been realized in the present moment are infrastructures of surveillance far beyond the military's capacity to render the data generated as usable information, and it's there that the current promoters of algorithmic warfare find their opportunity. In April of 2017, the U.S. Department of Defense announced plans for its flagship AI project, the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, codenamed Project Maven and accompanied by this rather astonishing logo. The announcement of Project Maven by then Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work asserted the urgent need to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning across DoD operations. The plan, as Work sets it out, includes an initial project focused on the task of labeling data within full-motion video generated by U.S. drone surveillance operations. Project Maven's aim, more specifically, Work states in his memorandum, is, quote, to turn the enormous volume of data available to the DoD in the form of full-motion video into actionable intelligence and insights at speed. The media reports surrounding Project Maven largely beg the question of the criteria by which objects are identified as legitimate targets or imminent threats. So we're told that some 38 categories were used by those who had labeled the first 150,000 images for the initial training data, including the object pictured here, which is labeled an ISIS pickup truck. This is in the context of U.S. drone wars at the time, the so-called War on Terror. So what we're seeing here is a drone pilot's display in a ground control station showing a truck from the view of a camera on an MQ-9 Reaper drone. The Reaper is a so-called hunter-killer armed unmanned aerial vehicle, and is designed to engage what the military calls time-sensitive targets on the battlefield. Project Maven raises the question, though, of the correspondence between systems for categorization of images of objects, in this case, a truck, and how objects are incorporated into complex and changing relations and associated practices. As Grégoire Chamaillot observed a decade ago in his book, A Theory of the Drone, the claims for precision that justify new investments in automated targeting systems are based on a systematic conflation of the relation between, on the one hand, a weapon and its designated target, and on the other hand, the identification of what constitutes a legitimate target in the first place. No amount of improvement in the precision of targeting in the first sense can address the inaccuracies and uncertainties of data-driven targeting in the second sense. This conflation is part of a campaign to deny the increasing reliance of these systems on ever more questionable forms of stereotypic profiling of what and who constitutes an imminent threat. The primary developer of what is now named Maven Smart Systems is the company Palantir, led by self-satisfied master of digital war, Alex Karp, who in August secured a $10 billion contract with the U.S. Army, and that's just one among many contracts with both the Department of now War and with Homeland Security in the United States. Command and control in the moment of generative AI is to be built on top of Palantir's AI platform for defense and military, offering access to an LLM-based backend through a dashboard that includes a ChatGPT-style conversational interface. Palantir assures its military customers that the platform has been designed to activate data and models, quote, from classified systems to devices on the tactical edge, to maintain a real-time representation of the battle space. While little is publicly known about the current state and technical detail of Palantir's AI platform, the 8-minute promotional video demo that accompanied its launch in early 2023 gives us some insights into how the platform is promoted as working in a warfighting setting. Not surprisingly, Palantir has chosen a scenario set in a battlefield, strikingly like that of tank-based warfare in Ukraine, pitting friendly forces against enemy forces and featuring military units engaged in the operations characteristic of modern warfighting. But we might ask, through what automated processes and human labors the real-time data on which the system depends are made and updated, and the data models refreshed? What are the ground truth data sets for warfighting? And what are the implications and limits of the scenario chosen, with the tidy arrangement of forces in the battle space and absence of non-combatants, as well as the unambiguous military status of its focal objects? What questions are left begging regarding the reliance of data models on the social sorting of good guys and bad, friends and enemies? This matters to the legitimacy of warfare because those distinctions are at the foundation of international humanitarian law, where what differentiates murder from the legally acceptable taking of life turns on the principle of distinction between those who are in combat and pose an imminent threat and those identified as civilians or otherwise out of combat. So under IHL, even if you are a military combatant, if you are surrendering or wounded or otherwise out of combat, you're no longer a legitimate target. This is a principle that remains crucial, I believe, as a resource for legal accountability in the face of its systematic violation in actual warfighting. The violations of IHL, accelerated by data-driven targeting, have become abundantly clear with the reported application of machine learning to targeting by the IDF in Israel's assault on Gaza. In a series of investigative reports published in the Israeli-Palestinian outlets Plus 972 and Local Call, Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham has given us detailed accounts of two of the IDF's current systems, named respectively Habzora, or the Gospel, and Lavender. The first report, published in November of 2023, draws on sources within the Israeli intelligence community who confirm that IDF operations in the Gaza Strip sanctioned the bombing of built structures in densely populated civilian areas, including residential and public buildings. We know those bombings are going on, but they are sanctioned by the IDF. Official legal guidelines require that selected buildings must house a legitimate military target, and we always hear the claim that there was such a target in the buildings that were bombed, and also that the building be empty at the time of its destruction. And the latter has resulted in the IDF's issuance of a constant and changing succession of unfeasible evacuation orders to those trapped in diminishingly small areas of Gaza. A direct corollary of this operational strategy is the need for an unbroken stream of candidate targets. To meet this requirement, Habzora is designed to accelerate the generation of targets from surveillance data, creating what one former intelligence officer who's quoted in the story's headline describes as a, quote, mass assassination factory. The second story, published in April of last year, describes how the system named Lavender dedicated to the targeting of individuals designed as suspected low-level Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants, was configured. In the occupied territories, surveillance, of course, includes massive amounts of aerial imagery, so from satellites to constantly circulating drones, cell phone signals that are taken as proxies for location and movement, biometric registration at hundreds of checkpoints, including facial recognition systems, and ongoing monitoring of digital communications and social media for targeted names and keywords. The training data for Lavender were reportedly based on features correlated with known Hamas or PIJ fighters, from which all individuals in the population data set were assigned a score from 1 to 100. And these features included things like whether someone moved around frequently, moved their cell phone around, and so forth. Many things that must be characteristic of almost everyone in Gaza. Based on these scores, the system marked some 37,000 people as probable militants and potential targets. The machine-generated targets that were above a given threshold were given only cursory review. So one source explained that he would spend roughly 20 seconds to confirm that the individual was male, given the prohibition with Hamas and PIJ against women fighters. Most notably, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza shifted the argument for AI-enabled targeting from claims to greater precision and accuracy to the objective of accelerating the rate of destruction. Then IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari confirmed that in the bombing of Gaza, quote, the emphasis is on damage, not on accuracy, end quote. For those who have been advancing precision and accuracy as the high moral ground of data-driven targeting, this admission must surely be disruptive. It shifts the narrative from a technology in aid of adherence to international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions to automation in the name of industrial scale productivity in target generation, enabling greater speed and efficiency in killing. More recently, as part of a joint investigation, Guardian journalist Harry Davies has worked with Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham to track the reliance of Israeli intelligence on Microsoft's Azure platform for cloud storage to enable processing of the mass surveillance data used to facilitate the targeting of Gaza and to detain or kill Palestinians in the West Bank. On September 25th, Davies and Abraham reported that in response to an external review commissioned by Microsoft following their investigative report, along with pressure from employees and investors, Microsoft has walked back its earlier claims that there was no evidence that Azure had been used to target or harm people in Gaza. Microsoft has now withdrawn access by Israel's military spy agency Unit 8200 to the cloud storage and AI services it was using to collect and analyze millions of Palestinian civilian phone calls made each day, on the grounds that the usage to plan lethal airstrikes and detain Palestinians in the West Bank violates the company's terms of service. This decision, which I think is laudable, does not affect Microsoft's wider commercial relationships with the IDF, of course, which is a long-standing client and will retain access to other services. According to the Guardian's intelligence sources, Unit 8200 now plans to transfer the data to the Amazon Web Services cloud platform. This move brings the problem into the purview of a wider organization of tech workers, No Tech for Apartheid, who describe themselves as, quote, a worker-led campaign of Google and Amazon workers organizing against their company's $1 billion Project Nimbus cloud computing contract with the Israeli government and military. So let me close with the help of two scholars, beginning with the political geographer Louise Amoore. In her book Cloud Ethics, Amoore insists on the resilience of that which escapes datafication as a resource when she writes, quote, when machine learning algorithms segment a social scene, generating clusters of data with similar propensities, everything must be attributed. Yet that which is unattributable does remain within the scene, exceeding the algorithm's ability to show and tell, as well as opening on to a different kind of community and a different mode of being together, of being ethico-political. The different kind of community required for cloud ethics requires recognizing that data are made, not mined, that it is always and irreplaceably humans whose classificatory practices render data meaningful. So while we need to pay attention in the current moment to the enormous expansion of signal-generating infrastructures, we also need to attend to that which continues to escape capture by datafication, for better and worse, from complex social relations to the lived experiences of those who find themselves at the center of targeted discrimination and the exercise of violent power. The aim with respect to the latter is to destabilize the logics through which technomilitarism perpetuates its imaginary of rational and controllable state violence, while obscuring its genuinely senseless and ungovernable injuries. Judith Butler directs our attention to the limits of intelligibility as a site of openings when they write, quote, "Not only is it necessary to isolate and identify the peculiar nexus of power and knowledge that gives rise to the field of intelligible things, but also to track the way in which that field meets its breaking point, the moments of its discontinuities, the sites where it fails to constitute the intelligibility for which it stands. What this means is that one looks both for the conditions by which the object field is constituted, but also for the limits of those conditions, the moments where they point up their contingency and their transformability. Acknowledging the limits of datafication, it follows, opens our thinking to other modes of knowledge making that might configure our relations differently. Rather than further incorporation into the closed world imaginary of datafication, military operations need rereading through a performative understanding of accountable perception and action. Read in that way, the radical openness of a world of many worlds poses an enduring problem for the project of militarism and its promises of accuracy and containment. Challenges to the technopolitical imaginary of closed world militarism based on critical scholarship, investigative journalism, and creative forms of diplomacy destabilize the promise of clean demarcations of enmity within complex relations of affinity and difference, recovering the realities that escape datafication, and redirecting attention and resources invested in the security of some to projects in de-escalation, innovative diplomacy, and demilitarization in service of social justice and planetary security for all. And I will end there.
Thank you, Lucy. That was a fascinating talk. I very much appreciate your comments. We're now going to move to the discussion period, and we welcome questions from all of our participants. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom, or you can type your question into chat. We welcome you to turn on your cameras to ask your question, and if you are comfortable doing so, to do that. Our team will send a request for you to unmute when it's your turn to speak. So thank you, and I'll just take a look. Oh, Rhonda, could you please ask a question? I see you have your hand up. Thanks.
Yes, thank you
Hi,
so much.
Rhonda.
Hi, Lucy. Of course, I was, I've been a fan for so long, and I've had wonderful opportunities to speak with Lucy, both in group during my PhD, but also in person one-on-one. So thank you so much, Lucy. That was pretty incredible. I'm taking the pleasure of a first question. Of course, I know your work from Human-Machine Reconfigurations, and you have even since that time tried to unsettle these ideas of the closures, right? Which you're leaning now into this open-closed concept yet again. And in Human-Machine Reconfigurations, you talked about the sort of contingent entanglements between humans and machines. In the talk today, you're extending this within AI and particularly using warfare as the sort of site for investigation. So the question I have is, do you still think it's possible to rupture this closed world logic that we're seeing not just in sort of militarized AI, but also through a kind of a hostile, almost militaristic understanding of economies that we're seeing in the US, kind of this idea of closing yet again, even from an economic perspective. Do you still think it's possible to rupture this from inside, or have these human machine assemblages within the AI become too deeply embedded in our infrastructures to permit genuine ethical and political openings?
Well, thank you, Rhonda. That's a great question. And thank you for looping it back to human-machine reconfigurations and arguments that I made many years ago about differences that matter between humans and machines and what's going on at the interface. Really, again, there the argument, as you suggest, was the interface between the closed worlds within which machines operate in reference to their own state changes, whatever form those might take, and the open worlds in which we engage with them and with each other. And your question about my hopefulness about destabilizing. I mean, of course, I'm here in the aftermath of last night's election in New York City, so I'm feeling more hopeful than than usual. But and I don't think that's irrelevant. Because again, if we go back to the wonderful Leonard Cohen lyric about, there is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. So really, in a way, what I'm doing here is trying to work with the difference between the discourses of militarism, which reiterate over and over and over this insistence on containment as the only way of achieving security. And then represent themselves as always about to attain this state of perfect omniscience and control. So that discourse on the one hand, and then all of the ways in which that discourse is challenged, tragically by what we see actually going on the ground wherever violent conflict is happening, but also through and that's why for me investigative reporting is so important. The investigative reporting that taps into people inside these institutions, and they're everywhere. People inside these institutions who actually believed what they thought they were signing up for, and then came to discover and to become disillusioned, but maintained their integrity, and then they become the whistleblowers. They become the people prepared to talk about that gap, that slippage, right? And so this, I think, is it, like all social movements and forms of social change. It's a slow, always uncertain process, right? In terms of whether it can happen adequately and quickly enough to, and as you say, the things become so sort of deeply embedded in the infrastructures of our everyday lives. And as a U.S. citizen who kind of came of age during the 1960s, watching the damage that militarism does not only to all of its targets around the world, but to the United States itself, right, is heartbreaking, right? So I guess I would just end by saying that part of the reason that I reference Mondami is that I do think in the moment local is sort of where perhaps the most hope is. Really interesting things are happening in the United States at the city council, county board of supervisors, and even state level. And interestingly, those are the places, of course, where people really understand what's going on the ground, right? They're not understanding the state of the U.S. economy through models. They are experiencing it and, in contact with people who are experiencing it. So yeah, thank you. That's a great question to think with.
Thanks, Beth. I know I had a message thanks, Rhonda. I had a message from Beth Coleman, who has been unable to raise her hand but wanted to ask a question, and I'm hoping that the SRI team can unmute her so that she can ask her question. Oh, great. Hi, Beth.
Hi,
Hi,
Beth.
thanks, Lucy. Yeah, I can't figure out this technology. So are you suggesting that there's, maybe it never went away, but the value of ground truth is resonant here? There is ground truth.
Yeah, okay, great question.
But that's not my question.
Oh, no, I want to, okay.
But answer that, yeah.
Okay, just briefly. This is like a huge question, of course. It brings us into the realm of truth and truthiness. But I do think, the question of how ground truth gets constituted technically in relation to a colloquial reading of that phrase is just really important. And what kind of, evidentiary accountabilities are there in each case, right? And what kind of frames of reference are there in each case? And I think that is really relevant and definitely tied to what I'm talking about.
Okay, good. That's helpful. So I wanted to ask you about, in some ways, rhetorical actions here. At a point in time before we were totally buried in the avalanche, you had recommended that every time we said artificial intelligence, that we might substitute the phrase advanced automation. And I do continue to practice that when I write and I speak, but I'm also feeling more and more like, is that sufficient for what's going on here? So I ask that in relationship to two different directions. One is certainly artificial intelligence does frame us in a closed world where there's nothing outside of datafication. So anything that cannot be datafied doesn't count. It cannot be counted. So there's that aspect to it. But I'm wondering along the lines of someone like Kate Hale's argument around AI cognition in terms of capacities of sensing, of processing, of responsiveness. And I'm not sure I can say environment, but some of that idea of machine cognition or alien cognition or intelligence, which is really coming from Jeff Hinton as well. And both of those folks were on campus last week, so I'm awash in it. Where does that go with your idea of like, let's stick with advanced automation? Because that clarifies, it deracinates from any kind of agentic or intelligent posture. And also, it's so deeply moving and intense how the military worlds also conjure kind of like the everyday world as well. So I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a pretty hardliner here. I am completely unmoved over my last 40 years of following developments in artificial intelligence on the question of machine agency as or cognition or agency as somehow approximating something that is human or even animal-like, right? I just think there are differences that matter between organic beings and machines. One, very importantly, machines are not, machines do not exist outside of their relations with us. They are entirely a product of our construction, and we are thoroughly responsible for them. And all of the arguments that I've made over the years about the differences between the frames of the processing, the frame, that we have now narrated ourselves as machines, of course, is what makes this more ambiguous. But I really think there, and I don't see any. I neither believe that there is any cognition unless we render cognition computational, and then of course machines can cognize all over the place. There's no more cognition in machines than there ever has been, and I so don't understand that why not celebrate machines as the particular kinds of beings that they are in the world. Why have to translate them into, anthropomorphic or other kinds of terms? So well, I could obviously go on about this, but that's kind of my short response.
Thanks for the question, Beth. There's someone on chat who has asked a question, Mariamu. I don't know whether you would like to ask the question yourself or whether you'd like me to ask the question. I'll wait about 10 seconds, and if I don't hear from you, I'll read your question for you. And Lucy, you can look. Oh, great. Terrific.
Okay.
Thank you. Floor is yours.
Basically, my question is, like, in our context, there's been a lot of funding towards defense, and I've been reading on it. And there's an argument that because Canada's personnel is so small and we don't have as much money as the States overall, that strategically incorporating technology as much as possible is basically the only choice. So I'm trying to think about how to think about that as someone who's historically never been pro-military in any capacity, but just like in the reality of, like the potential annexation, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that, the rhetoric now in Canada about, militarization is very, very sad and distressing. And, first of all, we don't want to try to ensure Canadian security by beginning to imitate the United States. That is not a winning proposition. Canada has always prided itself on differentiating itself from the United States. And I should say that I coincidentally, but maybe providentially, was sworn in as a Canadian citizen on Election Day of last year. so I'm now a dual citizen. So the calls on Canada to militarize and to rely in particular on investments in technology as an avenue to do that, I think really need to be resisted. I think Canada needs instead to double down on the ways in which it has always positioned itself outside of the U.S. military hegemony, and rather allied itself with other states and agencies internationally who are trying to be working against violent conflict. And so I think technology is not going to be the solution, and if anything, Canada now needs to be reinforcing its alliances outside the United States rather than signing up for the U.S. agenda. We could talk about Golden Dome, which is, the rebirth of Ronald Reagan's strategic defense or Star Wars initiative. This idea, and talk about closure and containment, right? I mean, you couldn't. The images of Golden Dome are just like that image I had on my first slide, except of course now they're gold because it's Trump's, vision. But that is not. We're not going to get to security in that way. And so I know that we're going to be awash in that. And I really think it needs to be resisted in every possible way.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So Kaushar is next, then Ron, then Vishnu, then Avery, just so you know where you are in the queue. Got a good lineup.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It was really, really insightful and conceptually really valuable, especially the idea of the closed worlds. I was thinking more so in the longer lineage, thinking about the logic of datafication and this instrumental rationality and more of this binary thinking, and some of these other logics that we associate with martial epistemologies. How have you seen that evolve over time, especially with this more popularization of thinking about LLMs and their use across these different platform companies? And then a bit, maybe a bit slightly unrelated, but sort of the role of us as artists and scholars and what we can do in terms of trying to resist some of this more, I guess, closed world kind of thinking, especially with regard to these martial epistemologies. And thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, the word instrumentalization is really key, right? And it's become kind of assumed or taken for granted that the value of things lies in the degree to which they can be instrumentalized. Language now, is instrumentalized. Literature, art. So and as you pointed out, that instrumentalization is part of this privileging of data, because that's the only way computational systems can have any purchase on the world. And so all of the important pushbacks that I think are coming from scholar activists, critical scholars, artists, musicians, fighting for their rights to maintain their relations with the things that they create, I think are extremely important. And also, I mean, this is such a big problem in the education realm. How to get away from the idea that the point of writing an essay, let's say, or the point of summarizing an article is to come up with either a more text or a paragraph, rather than to actually go through yourself a process of acquiring a practice and a competency and an ability. Very painful, right? All of us who read and write, we know it's really painful. And if people are under pressure, they don't, there's no time to actually read or write, then they're offered these alternatives, it's going to be extremely hard to resist. So it's part of the whole sort of let's slow things down. Let's remember why one reads and why one writes. It's as if, if you think about acquiring a technical competency like playing the piano, how could you in some way sidestep gaining the actual practice in your hands and become a pianist without ever having to do that, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't really make any sense in any of these other domains as well. So I think we have to insist on that. Not the full answer, but I hope some pieces of one maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Ron Becker.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you.
Hi, Ron.
So there was a recent film, I don't know whether you've seen it, A House of Dynamite, and by Catherine Bigelow, and it raises again a specter that we haven't seen in media for a while because there have been too many other specters of nuclear holocaust. And so my question is, how does the ascendance of AI in military planning affect our perils in this regard? And I was thinking back to the movie, and the movie, in fact, sort of highlights the difficulties human beings, in this case, the president, has to deal with critical world-altering decisions in 15 or 20 minutes. So I can imagine people in the Pentagon saying, see, we told you so. We've got to put all this under control of AI.
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie. I've read some reviews. It's got sort of mixed reviews, but I'm looking forward to seeing it. But as I mentioned there, and as you're saying, there's now this just unbelievably distressing revival of nuclear weapons as somehow acceptable, and the as you know, Ron, I was involved in the early 1980s in putting together computer professionals for social responsibility following the lead of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and that was in large part in response to Reagan's Star Wars initiative, and in particular the idea of launch on warning, which is, the logic that things are happening so fast that you have to automate the process of detection of an incoming missile and responding. As long as we're not able to question these timeframes, then I think the power of this call for automation is going to be there. I'm not sure so much from the Pentagon always, right? I mean, I think, again, I even think in the military, there are people who have integrity and who understand how these things work and who are themselves going to be pushing back against this. But if we can't step back from, this whole arms race framing and slow things down, I think that is that should be our major campaign. Slow things down. That is the path to security, right? And so I think that's just key. The way that time gets weaponized in these situations in support of automation, in this case of weapons that we all thought we had basically just declared could never be used, right? So yeah. I'll watch the movie.
Thanks, Ron. Vishnu Natur.
Yes. Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much for the talk. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. You say that there's some component to reality or experience that escapes datafication, right? And I'm assuming that you will still assert this as our capacities to datafy grow, right? We have let's say we have brain computer interfaces and we have abilities to sort of reconstruct everything that the human mind is experiencing, etc. That's still datification. What's an example of something that escapes datification? Yeah.
Right. So all of those processes that you cited, they require translations into data are basically discrete calculable units, right? So all of the processes that you described, brain machine interfaces, require treating the operations of the brain as translatable into signals. And that can be done. It might even in some cases be done very usefully for people who suffer disabilities of various kinds. And however, other people who study brains, and I'm thinking now of Gillian Einstein, who's at U of T, a neuroscientist, point out that the brain is not actually a computer. The brain is an organ. It is an organ that is deeply embedded in relation to bodies and all sorts of other bodily systems, metabolic systems. Bodies, in turn, are not discrete units, but they're in cultural and historical and specific relations with other bodies in a very dynamic and contingent way. So it's only if we accept the premise that the relevant things that we're interested in can be perfectly translated into computational terms that logic that you're setting out would hold. And if we don't accept that, if we believe that computation is an incredibly powerful process, but it requires translations into discrete computational units that invariably they betray the things that they're rendering by leaving out, excluding those things that can't be made computable, then we're always going to be in the situation where computation has a particular place and particular kind of power, but is not equivalent to or adequate to actually rendering the worlds that we know and love and live in together. So I hope that's at least part of an answer.
Thanks, Vishnu. Avery Slater.
Okay. Thank you so much for an amazing talk. So I want to ask you also a question about datafication and the kind of shift in your talk title from closed to open world. I want to ask it through something that recently sort of happened to Palantir. So
Okay.
Michael Burry, right, the person who famously shorted the subprime mortgage market back in 2008, recently in very publicized tweet, etc., shorted Palantir. And in the tweet that he sent out to announce that, sometimes we see bubbles. And then he quoted something from the movie War Games, which is about nuclear strategy, right? The only winning move is not to play. And I got thinking about there's something very interesting in what he did there, because we have this like previous model of military surveillance based on game theory and actually knowing when what nuclear weapon has been fired, and don't everybody do it because then we all die. But then Palantir's model is about prediction that's not about precision, as you kind of brought up from other examples. So, I think shorting Palantir actually, in a way, is not just a prediction of its future value in like a mathematical or computable sense, but it's also performative, right? In saying that I'm going to short Palantir, it actually creates the conditions for the stock to fall.
Exactly.
Right? So I wanted to ask you about the gap in between like machine learning that's about classification and prediction around classification, because you had some like technologies of labeling, right, that are about getting the object right. And if there's no name for the object in the frame, it doesn't exist. But then I think there's also a form of prediction that takes the relations between things that have been labeled in a frame and thinks about what might happen next, where that thing doesn't appear in the frame, but it can actually be predicted in the sense of it's probable that it will happen using like Bayesian regression, right? So I was wondering if when we go from the closed to the open world, and we go from kind of classification to other forms of prediction of what will happen, it's not as even the open world gets captured too. And maybe that's what you're kind of saying with the Leonard Cohen quote about there's a crack in the world. But even this broken world, like where can we find some place to weave through and not simply always be met at the next step by a kind of performative declaration of war? Or maybe that's not really right. That was sort of where it opened up for me, and I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about how you see that logic moving from like game theory and precision into we think the enemy will do this next, but if they don't, well, we at least recreated damage, right? That really just
yeah. No, thank you for that. I mean, just for a moment on the relations between classification and prediction, it seems to me that prediction in the algorithmic sense or the sense of machine learning or neural networks is always based on relations among that which is represented within the model. And the likelihood based on the model that if this thing happens, then that thing will happen, or if this thing is present, then that thing will be present, and so forth. None of which really gets at the performative. I mean, it's performative, again, I would say, within its own self-referential terms. Of course, the output of that comes into the open world, and has tremendous. It's now what you're pointing to are the performative consequences of the output of closed worlds, or of any kind of declaration of any kind of prediction of what's going to happen, is not a prediction about a future that's already happened. It is a prediction that then in part constitutes the terms for what's going to happen next. So that makes it really powerful. And that the way in which that is the case, I think, is part of what makes everything that we're talking about be unstable. And part of the reason that I end with that Butler quote is that I see Butler arguing that it's in sort of poking poking holes in the logics, the sort of self-sustaining logics, or disclosing the places, as Butler says, where they meet their breaking points. That we then again find ways of showing their contingent relations with the open worlds that they're part of, and the potential transformability that opens up. So again, your question is so beautiful and so complex, and all of the questions about what's the stability and the reiteration and the reproduction and how deeply entrenched we are in that, and then these possibilities for how destabilizing that can become a site of generative, in the good old sense of that word, transformative change. That's kind of the terrain, that I'm walking around in here. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Avery. Ezra?
Hi, thank you for this talk.
We can't hear you very well.
That'll probably help.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. So just going back to sort of the AI involvement in military, and obviously there's like a high level of comfort that the world has with the loss of life right now that is sort of interesting, and obviously that's something that we shouldn't be so comfortable with, and that sort of ties into slowing things down. But given the current state of the world, I'm sort of asking a question of, or maybe an assumption that we want the decision on who lives in the lives to be data driven, given it's one of the only frameworks that we sort of have to operate in. And I saw a quote from one of the IDF commanders saying that AI probably saved lives because it was more selective. And whether or not you choose to believe that or not, depending on whatever, there is a situation where that could be true in a future, like that is plausible. So I'm sort of wondering, is this also an alignment problem, and like we need to slow down until these tools are aligned? And is there a preference there of having a data-driven process that's well-defined consensus on this is who should be, this is how we should decide these things? And obviously alignment has, it's sort of like a almost a dirty word in the sense of it's overused and hard to define what that looks like. But that's my question of, is there a place for data-driven decision making that's sort of formalized, whether it's automation or intelligence?
Right. Well, let's just stay with the example, the IDF example, the military example. I mean, this goes back to this difference that I talked about, because the rhetoric about accuracy that accompanies the promotion of AI in the military. Accuracy, if we're talking about the accuracy of a weapon, so we've got a designated target. We know that's a legitimate target, and now we want the weapon that we fire to accurately hit that target. That's one sense of accuracy. The other sense of accuracy is the legitimacy of the target in the first place. And AI only enters into that by constituting the field of potential targets as through profiling. How do we, and we're talking about doing that in situations where it's increasingly people aren't wearing uniforms, conflict is happening in urban areas. So it becomes a form of guilt by association at best, right? We designate you as a legitimate target because you fit this profile. And of course, in the best case, that may be informed by all sorts of other intelligence on the ground. Like the legitimacy of a target can only be determined to the extent that there is knowledge of the relations on the ground that are happening. And data gives the promise that we can do this for mass numbers of people and at a distance. But that can only happen through the crudest forms of stereotyping. So it's a big problem. And then just the last thing to say about that is the phrase which I read over and over in military discourse about saving lives is always about saving our guys' lives. It's always about killing. And of course, that's what war is about. War is about saving each other's lives on the, among your compatriots. But every time they talk about saving lives, they're talking about killing somebody. And the question is, what are the grounds for that killing? And the bar for doing that in terms of the international frameworks that we have for war fighting has been seriously sort of dismantled. And I think we need to not just then give up, but really redouble our insistence on those legal frameworks. And there's lots we could talk about in terms of the IDF's relation to those legal frameworks, but I know we're running out of time here, so.
Thanks, Ezra. We are indeed, and thank you, Lucy. We are indeed running out of time. We have two more questions that I will see whether we can fit them in. And I'll encourage both the questioners and the responder to be brief.
Why don't we take them both together, and then
okay,
that'll make sure, yeah.
So Vera and George.
All right. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Vera.
It's good to see you. I'm going to ask a question, and I'll keep it brief. And I feel like maybe we've thought about this question, but how can we be sure that the closed world ideology is operational for some forms of advanced automation, as we might call it, if the recent academic output by OpenAI authors, and I'm thinking here about the Why Language Models Hallucinate paper by Adam Kalai and co-authors, argues that contemporary LLMs are going to have inevitable, irreducible uncertainty. And sort of they publicly concede this, that the perfect epistemic capture is impossible. And instead they do something with like perfectly calibrated or imperfectly calibrated risk. If that's the operation rather than the closed world, if we're looking to the cracks, I guess, like what happens if we look to the cracks for the light to come in, and what we find is that OpenAI is already there. That's my question.
So yes, thank you. And thank you very much for fitting my question, and I really appreciate it. One thing I'll say in listening to this conversation, and that you did reference the brain before, the human mind. And I think one of the real fallacies and one of the real dogmas with regards to AI is that it somehow does mimic or somehow operates along the lines of the human mind. And the idea that somehow this technology will advance to the point of, let's say, actual artificial intelligence. And what I want to say to that is that, and this is, in my mind, extremely important. And again, the idea that really AI is just advanced automation, which is that we don't understand the human mind. We don't understand the first thing about the human mind. How could we even believe that we could even replicate that in terms of technology when we don't have a theory of the human mind? So again, I think that's one of the real ideological barriers to the thinking that you're putting forward, is that people really do believe that there is something sentient about AI computing, and that we even understand human sentience, right? And so the idea of pushing back, rejecting artificial intelligence as nomenclature, and instead using the nomenclature you're putting forward, which is accurate actually, of advanced automation, I think that really crystallizes things to the idea that we have to have democratic inputs into this automation if this technology is ever going to serve humanity and not simply be the instrument of empire.
Great. Yeah, I really agree with you. I'll just go from George back to Vera, because I very much agree with you. And I think that some humility here is called for. I think that those who've already convinced themselves that the brain is a computer, and that sentience is about state changes to that machine coming in through sensors of various kinds and then generating output. It's going to be, and then of course it's going to be a hard job to convince them. But what you're saying is the rest of us can remain skeptics. And I have never argued in principle that AI is impossible. I've always tried to carefully argue for the differences that matter and continue to insist on the differences that matter between humans and computational machines, and the great left out from the way in which we are rendered in order to make us computable. So yes, and going back to Vera, I don't think OpenAI is really dealing with the cracks at all. I think bringing in risk and probability and more calculative instruments to use to try to control new forms of control is just more of the same, right? It's a symptom of the fact that they have nowhere else to go because they have a commitment to that kind of closure and containment and managing things within it. So, but surely that gets more and more elaborated, when they're challenged, they sort of up the game in terms of the sophistication of the machinery that's going to get thrown at the problem. But I don't think those openings are really being addressed.
And on that, I will thank Lucy for an excellent presentation, really, and very thought-provoking. Thank you so much for sharing your time and for your generous answers to the many different questions that we have. And thank you to the audience for asking so many great questions. I can
Great
see,
questions.
I hope that those of us who are in Toronto will continue some of these conversations through other vehicles. So this concludes our seminar. Please join us next week on Wednesday, November the 12th, as we welcome Sonia Katyal, Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. This event will be online as well, and for details, you can go to the SRI website. So again, thank you, Lucy, and wishing everyone a good end of the day, and to Lucy, better weather where you're located.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.